And as soon as it goes live, Andy leaves.
All right. If anyone in IRC can tell us when we're online. We just lost.
All right, well, I see Andy again, in theory.
All right. Do you want to start telling me your thoughts on when we should stop doing this?
So, yeah, since Andy's apparently having technical difficulties, we'll start. I wanted to hijack this early and make sure that we were not discussing dropping the i386 port, either officially or unofficially. That makes literally zero sense at this point in time. So if you want to have a discussion about the potential future of images, that's a different story, but dropping official support for i386 makes no sense, fundamentally because it still has many valid use cases, and we will have customers who ask us to support it regardless of whether we claim we don't. So at the end of the day, we're going to end up supporting it.
I'm just talking about 32-bit images.
Right, so that was the title, but then in your outline you talked about things like Lubuntu stating that they would step up to make i386 a supported port, and that then gets confusing because that starts talking about the port. So the port itself absolutely must stay, and hey, look, it's Andy. The port itself must stay and must stay supported.
I agree.
Images become a more interesting discussion when you take that into account. When you say that the port continues to be supported, well, I'm perfectly happy to say things like maybe the i386 images eventually should move off of releases and onto CD image and just be unofficial ones that we lightly smoke test or whatever. The existence of images makes automated QA much easier. There are QA tasks that are very difficult to do without some reasonable installation path, and so I'm perfectly happy. I would be perfectly happy nearly today, but it certainly makes sense to do with enough future lead time that people don't get scared. But I would be perfectly happy to move i386 from releases to CD image and say we don't support this image, and lightly smoke test it rather than put it through our horrible battery of tests that we currently do. That I think would be a perfectly reasonable thing to suggest doing for 1604. No longer producing the images, we can certainly talk about, and we've got an hour to do so. But the reality is that producing an image these days is actually very cheap. So the cost associated with an image is actually QAing the image. So if we say that we no longer officially support it, and the QA we throw at it is very light, quick smoke testing to make sure it doesn't explode your computer, then an image becomes very, very cheap. That would be my take as to what I think we should do to try to de-emphasize it. Make sure the website no longer has any links to it, although that's mostly true today. and just take it off the releases site and put it on the CD image site. So it's something you actually have to actively look for, and make sure that we make it clear that that's not a supported install path, despite the fact that the port itself is supported, that's difficult language to wrap your head around, but I'm sure we can figure that out. So that's my take. I assume your ultimate goal is actually to just stop producing the images entirely. What are your thoughts?
Moving them to CD image is probably a fine first step. But my thoughts were more from people who are trying to get people who are running 32-bit an upgrade path of some sort to move to 64-bit if they have a supported architecture, and also just focus. A lot of game companies and other companies are now focusing on just the 64-bit port, and to really emphasize, you can just focus there, and it makes their build process a lot easier.
Right. So I mean, fundamentally, as long as we continue to support the port, we always still have that problem that someone will figure out how to install it, and then they'll complain that their game doesn't work. But like I said, as long as we de-emphasize that installation path going forward, the majority of new installs should be MD64 regardless. The upgrade path is a much more difficult thing to sort out. Technically, we can do it. Technically, we have all the technology in place to more or less make it work. The reality is much less pleasant than the technical fantasy, however. Doing a side grade between architectures is currently still very painful. We have people who we can certainly throw at to make this work better. However, we're spread fairly thin, and I don't know that we can actually commit the resources to make a side grade a viable option by 1604. It's something we all want to do. It's something that none of us really have the time to complete.
I was wondering whether or not, I know the default installer can do a upgrade, I forget what the actual terminology is, but it basically just it leaves home in place and a few other places in place and just overwrites everything. Could we make that the official?
In theory, again, this one's a little more theory than reality. In theory, the Ubiquity replacement installer could be made to detect an i386 installation and install AMD64 over top. Where you could conceivably run into problems is that we intentionally save some bits of bar and your entire home directory and whatnot, and if anything in there is arch specific, it's going to explode on runtime. And that, unfortunately, other than a few things that we can spot check ourselves and know whether they're good or not, unfortunately the reality is we don't know. Like, we don't know what you have in your home directory and what's going to explode on upgrade. So it's a difficult problem to wrap your head around. We could certainly give it an option as an unsupported upgrade path. We could try that in the future. But fundamentally, it's much more difficult than it sounds. Like, the actual upgrade is very, very easy. It's just that at runtime, you may find that you have some database format or something that refuses to function in a backward-compatible fashion, what have you. Not quite as bad as like flipping Endian, for instance. Like if you were trying to do this from x86 to PowerPC, it would go horribly bad. But still, 32 to 64-bit, you may find that there's something that's in a native format that just doesn't work anymore. But it's certainly something to keep open, something to throw in your notes. It's a possibility. Yeah, and obviously that very same issue is an issue with the side grade option too. Because if you do an apt-based side grade, sure, we can replace all the packages, but we have no way of ensuring data integrity. Because we just don't know what's on your computer. Well, by design, we don't want to know what's on your computer, and you don't want us to know.
So we should recommend to those people that you just need to do a fresh install.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, the only sane thing when people are changing architectures is to tell them to wipe and start fresh. It would be lovely if we offer better upgrade paths, but realistically, and honestly, game developers that are focusing on only 64-bit, for instance, are A, in a minority, but B, they're also the cutting-edge sorts of games that tend to attract a certain type of user, and that certain type of user are the people who historically have reinstalled their operating system every 6 months anyway. And this was long before they used Linux. I mean, you remember back in the days of Windows 95 gaming and Win2K and whatnot, your machine would get a little bit crufty after 2 months of use, and you're like, screw this, and you throw it all over and start over. I think the PC gaming crowd is very open to the idea that if they want the best possible performance, formatting and starting over is fine. And most everybody else, frankly, isn't going to be running a game that's 64-bit only anyway. Now, another thing we could discuss on top of this, which actually requires buy-in from the man in the brown shirt there, is we could be shipping 64-bit kernels for i386. Now, currently that's doable via multi-arch, and maybe that's the right way to be doing it, but we could make that a more formally obvious solution. So if someone has an i386 install on 64-bit hardware, we could suggest that, hey, maybe they really want a 64-bit kernel with their 32-bit user space. And that also solves the 64-bit only gaming thing, because most games are entirely statically compiled except for libc, and maybe a couple other libraries, but usually it's stuff that's all multi-arch available or easily obtainable that way. So if you have a 64-bit kernel, 32-bit user space, and you need 7 64-bit libraries to make your game work, it's not actually that hard to make that function. So, I mean, if that's a use case you're really worried about, if you're worried about the fact that people can't run 64-bit software on their 32-bit systems, that's something to look at as well. We actually have several people in the company that run that configuration, that run 64-bit kernels on 32-bit user space, because it's more memory efficient, slightly faster in many regards. But when you need 64-bit, you need 64-bit.
As I understand it, the issues there is purely getting it to install. In theory, if it's the 64-bit one built on AMD 64 should just work.
Right. These days, since we fixed up some packaging stuff, installing a 64-bit kernel via multi-arch on i386 actually just works. It's how do we do that in an intuitive way for a user so that they don't have to figure out how to futz with it and make it work. And maybe that's something we could actually be detecting in the installer at install time. If your machine supports long mode and you're installing i386, we can install a 64-bit kernel for you. These are certainly options we could examine.
So then the 32-bit CD would basically be a sort of a hybrid.
Well, it would boot in 32-bit, but we could include the 64-bit kernel in the pool, or we could just pull it from the network if we detect that it's required.
So some people run into the issue where they have long mode, but for whatever reason they can't do that. They can't run the 64-bit install, whether it's a EUFI weirdness or whatever. How would this affect them?
I'm actually curious what those use cases are. So, because our 64-bit kernel should run on literally any Intel or AMD CPU that claims to have long mode. The kernel itself should be fine.
Okay.
Bootloader issues, I could see you potentially running into the biggest one, which is specific to certain Atom tablets and whatnot, but it's a problem we haven't solved at all anyway, is that there are machines out there, thank you Intel, that have 32-bit EFI and 64-bit CPUs. But those are a massive problem for us already because they also don't have legacy BIOS mode, so currently we can't install them at all. Fundamentally, absolutely, the best solution there would be a 32-bit EFI bootloader and a 64-bit kernel. I'd like to get there for 1604, make sure that happens. If you know anybody who has such hardware we can test on, that would be great. Because the majority of us, we're all well aware of the problem, and none of us have the kit to reproduce it, which means we'd be trying to fix it blind. which is not easy. But as far as stuff that we currently install and run on, I don't fundamentally see how offering a different kernel option is going to make things any worse.
Okay, cool.
So that's certainly something to look at. It would eat some CD space if we decided to actually ship that on the CD, but I don't think it's entirely unreasonable to say that you need network access for that particular option to kick in. So you install 32-bit, we detect that you have a 64-bit CPU, and you happen to have a network configured, then boom, we pull down the 64-bit kernel for you.
Now, what advantage would this have? I guess having a 32-bit user space, but what advantage would this have over if you have the 32-bit CD and you are on a 64-bit machine with long mode, just telling the user, hey, you could use the other CD?
And that's certainly that's the simpler possibility.
Okay.
And I'm not against either, or frankly both if we have the time to implement them, but a lot of this is all about assigning a bunch of work items that I don't know if anybody has the time to do right now. So, I mean, clearly the easiest thing for us to do going forward that is basically zero work is to just try our hardest to de-emphasize i386, throw it on CD image, make sure that most people aren't using it at all, and then time permitting as opportunistic goals, see if we can improve the 32-bit install experience to, sure, warn you that there's a better option out there. That one's pretty cheap and easy. Possibly install the 64-bit kernel automatically. That one's harder, but cool. So lots of little bullet points we can have here, but I think we need to make it clear that some of this is stuff we can't commit to, and we'll get to it if we get to it because it might be neat.
Okay.
But it's definitely worth examining all these different options so that we can pick and choose through the bullet points later and say, I've got a spare 3 hours in my life. Let me see if I can do that. So we've got literally zero IRC participation, which either means they haven't figured out how to watch this, or we've said nothing controversial.
It looks like I posted the wrong link.
Oops. Oh, well done. So yeah, Andy, that is the other point that Colin's bringing up, is that instead of relying on a multi-arch install, though I think that's still the right way to do it, we could just be building a 64-bit flavor on i386.
Yeah, I mean, that's just a build time issue.
Yeah, well, it means adding another flavor, but that's not really world-ending.
I guess it's not the end of the world. Well, you already produced.
Right. The fundamental problem there, I think, is that it means that we end up QAing, or at least pretending to QA, two kernels that are theoretically identical but might not be because of toolchain differences. Because the 64-bit build should be identical on AMD 64 and i386, but for whatever reason might not be, and that could drive us nuts.
Yeah, I mean, I'd certainly rather only have one if we can achieve it.
Yeah.
Can we do dependencies, cross-grade dependencies in AMD 64 meta packages to x86 32-bit i386 packages? Is there any way to represent that?
Oh, as in have an i386 meta package that pulls in the AMD 64 kernel? Yeah, that's certainly doable. It just means that package is completely worthlessly uninstallable unless you have multi-arch enabled. But it can be done. Yeah, as Colin points out, it is unfortunate that apt-get update then has to pull down twice as much stuff. Well, not actually twice as much because we split out translations, but a fair bunch more. But this is a sacrifice that our AMD 64 users have been making now for for a couple of years, and only a handful of them complain about it. Um, I would like to try to figure out how we can make that situation slightly less crap by deduplicating those lists a little better, but that's a sort of a long-term wish list as well.
So I think we've got roughly 5 actions so far, one of which is for you, Adam, to give the job of de-emphasizing 32-bit images to someone. I've got a couple to do some testing around 64-bit on 32-bit and look at meta packages, and then there's a couple of unassigned ones at the moment to think about what the installer could do. I think we can do those two.
Yeah, let me just make Colin actually talk. See if he has more to say. If I can. Where did my mouse cursor go? Dear Google, please give me my cursor back.
The other thing before we get off, I wanted to just, does this de-emphasizing after 1604 make sense, or do we want to do it sooner or later?
I don't really have much opinion there. I mean, from the point of view of the website, we've already de-emphasized it anyway. We very much tell people that AMD 64 is the default, and that's the one they should be installing. 32-bit UEFI has come up, Colin, but by all means, let's discuss it further because that is a sticky point.
Yeah, I mean, I only bring it up because it's something that, well, we've been effectively ignoring it for a while because of the multiple El Chorito images issue. It's not clear, though, to me that that's still a real issue. That was a problem on Macs of a certain vintage, and I think they may be fixed.
Right. However,
but it is something that I've had an increasing number of complaints about recently. This isn't actually, it's not something that's going away. On the contrary, the number of complaints I've had that we don't ship 32-bit UEFI images has actually been increasing over recent months.
It's definitely been going up, yeah. So the big thing there, though, is that other than like one specific system that was built 3 years ago, the majority of these 32-bit EFI systems are actually 64-bit CPUs, which leads
right,
one
the
to
problem
believe
is that you can't use a 64-bit kernel on 32-bit UEFI.
Can 32-bit EFI not actually jump into a 64-bit kernel?
I believe no, I could be wrong. I'm open to correction here, but I believe that the problem is that the 64-bit kernel cannot use the 32-bit firmware calls, and thus can't do anything.
Oh, okay, that's disgusting and needs fixing up too. But
I may be wrong on that. I would be very glad to hear that I'm wrong.
Right.
But
So
was at least at one point difficulty with that.
yeah, I did bring up earlier in this call that if someone had such hardware, I would love to see it, because all of us are well aware of the problems and the problem space. I don't know that any of us actually have played with it to a point where we comfortably know how to solve it. And fundamentally, I think it'll be actually fairly trivial for us to solve if we had hardware to bang around on. Well, it might not be trivial to solve this whole 64-bit kernel versus 32-bit firmware thing if that's a problem, but certainly making a 32-bit CD that works would not be hard. And if 32-bit EFI can jump into a 64-bit kernel and vice versa, that kernel can talk to 32-bit EFI. Theoretically, it might not be hard to make a 64-bit CD work as well, maybe.
Yeah, if that's the problem, then if a 64-bit kernel can talk to a 32-bit EFI, then all you need is a 32-bit bootloader in there, and those can already coexist in the same EFI system partition. I think there's also somebody ought to look at whether there's a separate El Chorito type defined, or whether you have to have something that knows how to jump between them or something. You might have to have a very clever shim.
Have you ever tested the theory to see if regular 64-bit EFI can boot a 32-bit bootloader?
I've not tested that personally. I was assured years ago by Intel that was impossible.
Okay, that's unfortunate, but oh well. Thanks, Intel, for making our lives exciting.
Yeah, I think that's the case. This is all rusty, years old memory, but
Right.
I'm reasonably sure that you can't.
So yeah, I think if this is something we care about, and it's something we should care about, because those systems certainly seem to be multiplying, probably need to take an action item. Go ahead, Andy, and throw my name on it. Need to take an action item to actually figure out if we can just expense one of these systems, stick it on a desk, and figure out how to make it work.
Yeah, these are all quite cheap hardware, aren't they?
Yeah, well, actually, I think the Minnow board might have 32-bit EFI, and that's really cheap. So, not hard to get our hands on one. We just need to. And yeah, certainly that plays into the discussion about potentially dropping images as well, because if we have to have a 32-bit image and a 64-bit image, and they can't coexist, or at least a 32-bit EFI bootable and 64-bit EFI bootable, whatever. Except are those different? Are they different boot image names and could then theoretically coexist on the same file system?
They can coexist. They're different boot image names in the sense of the subdirectory of /EFI on the EFI system partition.
Okay.
You get EFI x86-64 and EFI i32. Whatever the names are.
Okay, so one could theoretically boot a CD or build a CD to boot both.
Well, remember, it's a little bit different from CDs. That's why I was saying we needed to look into the L32 issue, because the CDs don't quite use the regular EFI system partition layout in the same way.
Right. Then there's that removable media path as well, which is a constant thorn.
There's the removable media path, but I think that is more relevant for USB sticks. On CDs, the way that it boots is actually via a separate boot catalog entry for with a platform ID of 0xEF, meaning EFI. And I don't know how you deal with multiple ones of those. There's probably a way to find, but I don't know what it is.
I don't know how it is that people keep reinventing wheels and making them more complicated than the previous wheel.
So, I mean, have a look at. It might even be worth just having a look at Fedora images and seeing what they're doing at the moment. The Dumpet, D-U-M-P-E-T, is a useful tool to use to inspect this sort of thing.
All right, so that's sort of a side topic to this whole thing.
Oh,
definitely something we need to think about.
So, in fact, the Fedora 17 image, which I happen to have lying around, has two.
Why wouldn't you?
Because why wouldn't I? I deleted it once. Why would I ever remove it? Or downloaded it. It has two 0xEF sections in its L32 headers, so it's possible that it has.
That doesn't sound like a firmware bug waiting to happen.
On the other hand, it only ships EFI boot x64.EFI, so maybe it means something else. Okay, so discount Fedora 17. I don't think it's relevant.
Right. Like I can tear that apart and see if they're doing anything fancy later.
Yeah.
I mean, the first cut obviously would just be to build something that boots on a machine of that spec, and then see if we can turn it fancy. I mean, frankly, my first cut I think would just be to see if we can give them a DI image, because they'd be super happy about that. Any install path is better than none.
So, I mean, you were talking about the description for this session was sort of premised on decommissioning all of the paths at the same time, roughly. Did you talk about whether it makes sense to have the same schedule for everything?
Expand on that?
Well, I mean, if you're one of the things that has been useful in the past when we've decommissioned things on the desktop image is that we've had other install paths available for some.
Oh, right. So I mean, fundamentally, the first 15 or so minutes that you missed out on, we talked about, this is not about dropping the port, and nobody shall ever suggest that again, at least not for many, many years.
Well, we have to before 2038, but yeah.
Oh, we may come up with a clever hack for the timestamp. But by 2038, we might be doing trinary computing or something and have to rewrite all our software anyway. So A, this is not about dropping the port. B, so what follows on from that is that obviously BDI images will always continue to be produced because every port has them, and it's zero cost for us to produce them. B, then we started talking about, well, do we really want to drop images or do we just want to heavily de-emphasize them? So the first cut there is, maybe by 1604 or immediately afterwards, rather than not producing the i386 images, we should just move them from releases to CD image. Make sure that people understand that this is not a canonical supported install path, and we drop the very heavy QA of those images and instead just smoke test them, which makes their production and publishing significantly cheaper, but it doesn't completely remove the option of using them. And I think that's probably a sane and conservative way forward, given that producing images is not actually expensive for us anymore. It's really the QA that is.
Yeah, there's still some expense associated with shipping them, but most of that correlates with whether they're on releases versus CD image.
Right. Right, so I think that's more or less what we settled on, and then we devolved into many topics about, can we make the 32-bit images detect that you're running 64-bit, tell you to use the other CD, or automatically install the 64-bit kernel, blah, 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 all sorts of fancy things.
So on the Ultra issue, I was just digging up the spec on that. The way it actually works is that the Ultra header indicates an EFI system partition and gives you the offset of that system partition, and then it does the usual thing for picking that apart.
So we only need EFI partition.
Right. So we only need one. We only need one L-Trito pointer, and then we can ship multiple loaders inside that.
Okay, so
as far as I can tell, modulo firmware bugs, that there's no obvious reason that shouldn't work.
Cool. And we already have a 32-bit Grub EFI, right?
Yes.
Built on AMD64.
We don't have it signed. I don't know if Secure Boot is relevant to any of these. But yes, it's built on AMD64. It's Grub EFI IA32.
Okay. Signed should definitely happen, but certainly not for testing. We don't give a crap if it's signed for testing.
Shim, I think you may have an issue then with Shim. I think is only built for x86-64, and
yeah, I think that's a solvable problem, though.
If you need to do signing, then you need to build a 32-bit variant of that. You may run into GNU EFI being hideously painful.
I vaguely recall playing with GNU EFI 32-bit a couple of years ago.
Yeah, the problem with GNU EFI is that it breaks from version to version in painful ways. That's Steve about that.
Anyhow, I think these are all tractable problems, which the word tractable is not. So, yeah, we can definitely look at all that. I think adding fanciness to installers and playing with weird upgrade paths and whatnot, that's sort of if we ever have time, which realistically probably means most of that's not going to happen. But
the sort of fanciness you were talking about in the installer is really not that fancy.
Well, it depends on which fanciness we're referring to. So I think having it detect that you're long mode and telling you to use the AMD64 CD instead, that's really easy. Going beyond that and saying, oh, well, maybe we should be installing a different kernel and whatnot, it's not super fancy, but it's a little harder, et cetera, et cetera. So,
sure. I mean, I was just saying that having it do kernel selection is something that there's already a lot of code for other ports.
Right. That's absolutely
not actually that hard.
There was other installer fanciness suggested as well, like, hey, why don't we have the replacement upgrade process of the live CD be able to turn an i386 into an AMD64, which theoretically is not actually hard, but then you run into the, how do I know that none of my data is Arch specific?
Yeah.
Actually, on top of that, if we de-emphasize to move them to unsupported in 1610, let's say, into CD image, and the 32-bit archive is still supported, what happens to the upgrade path to like 1804 for 32-bit users?
Well, it's still in the archive, so they still have an upgrade path. I mean, it's it's to an architecture we're caring about less and testing less, but
Okay.
it's still a valid upgrade path.
Okay.
Yeah, the upgrade paths don't break at all because most people don't upgrade using a CD. So,
Right.
Yeah. I mean, the more we work on multi-arch incrementally, the more feasible it becomes for real humans to do a cross-grid. It's not in any way productized right now, but it is possible.
Yeah, we discussed that as well. That does still run into the same potential, how do you know none of your data is Arch specific problem. But I think from x86 to x86, the majority of that's going to be a non-issue, right up until it is. But I mean, those whatever. It's something a lot of us would like to spend time on, and I don't know how many of us will have time to spend time on it. So I will make no promises, but cross-grading is something we'd all like to see working better. But do we have at least a satisfactory consensus about the whole de-emphasizing of i386 post-LTS? Moving to CD image, I think, sounds like a good idea.
Oh, I wanted to just specify there. We're talking about the Ubuntu with Unity image, cloud images,
Ubuntu
and
desktop,
server image.
Yeah. Server already doesn't build i386. They stopped a while ago. I thought. Or maybe they just discussed it and never did.
They sure do build them.
Oh, they still do? Okay, whatever. They discussed it a while ago and then didn't. Well, maybe that's because I told them not to. Because at the time there were still valid use cases, and I think there still are. But I think the most valid use case for i386 is actually the cloud, not standard server equipment. So cloud images, that's a discussion that we'd want to bring Ben or Scott in on, and neither one of them showed up for this. So we're not going to make the decision for them. So the decision we're making right now is definitely for the desktop CD, I think, and potentially the server CD, but not necessarily the cloud stuff. However, we've had completely different discussions over the past month or two about how we can make the server CD and the cloud images and various other server offerings all essentially be the same thing. So this may all play into that as well. So on the server side, I think we should just say they're doing what they're doing and they can figure that out themselves in their own timeline. But I think moving the desktop i386 CD to CD image around that time makes perfect sense.
Okay, cool.
Because those are also the users who fundamentally, the desktop users are the ones that you're most afraid are going to be accidentally installing the wrong thing and then complaining, right? If a server admin installs a 32-bit system, there's probably a really good reason for it. Like, they're probably not morons. I think we give them the benefit of the doubt that they had a really good reason to want a 32-bit system. Whereas a desktop person is just going to grab the first CD they find, and if it's the wrong one, then they'll complain that things don't work the way they should.
Right. Okay. Sounds good to me.
All right, I've got nothing else to add. I say we all take a coffee break.
Cool. Thank you, everyone.
Perfect. Thanks.
Cool.